Hello, and welcome to today's webinar sponsored by CEEZER, From Scope 3 to Success, Mastering Supply Chain Climate Action. I'm John Davies, Network's President at Trellis Group, and I'm pleased as always to welcome listeners from around the world. Before we begin, I've got a few housekeeping details. This platform has a number of features that I'll be pointing out. As shown on the slide, you can resize and move around the various windows on the webinar platform to optimize your viewing experience. On the bottom of your screen, there's a toolbar with various buttons. You can download the resources from today's webinar by clicking on the button marked Resources. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with all registrants later today. If you have questions for today's speakers, simply click on the Q&A button and type your question into the Q&A window that appears. We'll be fielding those later on in this program, but don't hesitate to ask along the way, especially if there's any clarification about what one of the presenters has said. You can also chat with other attendees at any time by clicking the group chat button. And finally, feel free to share what you're learning with your social networks by tagging us at Trellis. And now on to today's discussion. We're here to explore practical ways to scale your climate program across your entire supply chain. Our expert panel will share real-world insights on engaging suppliers, leveraging carbon credits, and creating meaningful impact across your full business ecosystem. And so today you'll learn how leading companies are working to scale climate initiatives across complex supplier networks, and why traditional approaches to supplier engagement often fall short, and what drives meaningful vendor participation. And finally, you'll learn how to create a value chain climate program that balances central control with stakeholder autonomy. So joining me today is Dr. Carla Woydt, Chief Impact Officer at CEEZER, Kat Malek-Hood, Responsible Sourcing Manager, the Estée Lauder Companies, Kendall, Partner Success Lead, Supplier Leadership on Climate Transition, and Nathan Renneboog, Natural Solutions and Scope 3 Consultant. And so now to start our discussion, I'm going to pass it off to Nathan.
Thank you, John. First of all, I'd like to thank Trellis and CEEZER for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. With the 10 minutes that I have allocated in today's session, I'd like to give a very brief introduction to myself, give a bit of an overview of the history of Scope 3 accounting, and share some of my priorities with this sector moving forward. So as a quick intro, I mean, my background is very much on the technical side. I studied mathematics and geospatial tech and worked for organizations like NASA and the BBC before jumping into the nature-based solution space in 2014. I initially worked with Permian Global, a private carbon project developer, spent a lot of time on the Katingan-Mentaya project, and then more recently have been working with Systemic and Regeneration, the latter being a collaboration between Systemic and Palladium focused on greening tropical supply chains. I'm also part of CEEZER's Scientific Advisory Board, which I think is relevant here. And as my background might suggest, my focus and the lens with which I guess I look at Scope 3 is very much on the flag side of things, so the forest, land use, and agricultural sector. So jumping into a bit of a history of Scope 3 accounting, say the origins really are coming all the way back into the 90s of 2G accounting, starting with the 1997 launch of the Kyoto Protocol, quickly followed in 1998 by the launch of the GHG Protocol by the World Resources Institute, and a few years later in 2001, the release of Corporate Accounting and Reporting Standard, with essentially the introduction of the kind of Scope 1, 2, and 3 accounting. In the decade that followed, Scope 3 was essentially optional and was generally overlooked. Reasons being, the data challenges, lack of direct control, and so forth, and so it wasn't really a particular focus. That focus started increasing as we moved into the next decade. And in 2011, we saw the launch of the corporate value chain Scope 3 accounting and reporting standard, and that increasing attention to supply chain emissions. That essentially then built up to the middle of the decade, where first in 2014, we saw the launch and the start of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which, as many are probably familiar with, is the organization that's helping corporates set their emission reduction targets in line with the 1.5 degree target. And then quickly thereafter, of course, in 2015, we saw the Paris Accord, where we aligned on the 1.5 degrees. And so during that time, Scope 3 started becoming a bit more of a focus. And for example, with SBTI, it became a requirement for corporates who Scope 3 emissions account for more than 40% of their total emissions. That certainly for the flag sector is a relatively low threshold, with many of those types of organizations looking at their Scope 3 accounting for upwards of 90% of their emissions. And that really leads us then almost into today in the 2020s, where we've really seen an increase in mandatory Scope 3 accounting, as well as a rise in that voluntary accounting under SBTI. So here in the EU, we've seen CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, actually requiring the reporting of Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. At the same time, we have seen tightening of rules of Scope 3 in other jurisdictions such as the UK, Japan, and Canada. And here in Europe, also seeing the proposed CSDDD, so the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which won't only require the reporting on Scope 1, 2, and 3, but also reporting on essentially the decarbonization pathway in line with the 1.5 degrees. And that's essentially where we are today. But that journey is primarily referring to the target setting and the actual accounting of Scope 3 emissions, and it doesn't address as much the interventions and the financing mechanisms, where of course carbon credits are one of the more established ones. So I think it might be helpful to just take 1 minute to go back through that timeline wearing the carbon credit hat, so to speak. And so if we do that, we go back to the Kyoto Protocol and of course CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, quickly followed by the launch of other carbon frameworks such as the VCS, the Gold Standard, and others. And for lack of a better term, we kind of entered the era of the carbon cowboys, where there were too many projects with aggressive baselines, poor additionality, poor revenue shares, and so forth. And that's quickly led to improvements of methodologies and standards across the board. Some easy examples being the improvements in the VCS unplanned deforestation, but plus methodologies, or the phasing out of renewable energy credits due to their pure financial additionality. At the same time, we've seen the launch of things like rating agencies, the likes of Calix Global, Silverum, BeZero, and others, who are bringing in another angle, allowing corporates to differentiate not only different type of credits, different projects, and different methodologies, with more information beyond what has been provided by the standards and the third-party auditors. And all of this kind of coincided, of course, with a lot of media attention. Many are probably familiar with the Guardian articles on REDD+ and so forth. And simultaneously, while these improvements have been happening on the methodologies and in the carbon markets, organizations like SBTI and VCMI have been providing increased clarity on the claims that can actually be made when we're using carbon credits, and on what these decarbonization pathways need to look like to be in line with 1.5 degrees and with the latest science. So where are we now, I guess? We're seeing a lot of increased interest in accounting for GHG emissions and for reducing those emissions. Many corporates are trying to figure out their GHG accounting, their baseline, their methods for actually reducing those emissions. And for me personally, it's that last piece that I'm quite focused and interested on, is how do we reduce the emissions throughout these supply chains, as well as maximize the removals, because for many of these corporates, hitting their targets is going to be impossible solely via emission reductions. High quality removals are going to be needed as well. And so what mechanisms do we have available now? I mean, we of course have carbon credits, which the audience is probably fairly familiar with. It's a clear financing mechanism, has pricing benchmarks, has a lot of, has plenty of history. Credits can be produced via baselining interventions. You actually have your third-party auditing mechanisms and such, and there's a lot of different demand routes, whether it's pure offsets, addressing the residual emissions under SBTI, using them under insetting or beyond value chain mitigation strategies. Outside of that, we've seen the rise of the GHG protocol about as well, with the GHG protocol's flag document to be released by the end of the year. And so that's, of course, focused on within value chain mitigations. It really uses an inventory approach year over year. It has a lot of differences. Doesn't include, for example, a third-party auditing mechanism for small and medium enterprises. It requires things like reporting on your scope 1 and 2 emissions along a pathway of a removal if the corporate wants to claim removals from its supply chain. So a few complications there. And we're also seeing newer things like the Verra Scope 3 standard, where I should share that I don't work for Verra, but I am part of the Verra Scope 3 standard development group. And this standard is really looking to bridge almost the carbon credit and inventory worlds a little bit. It uses inventory units and provides methodologies to account for those interventions, and uses a lot of the mechanisms and processes you might be a bit more familiar with from the carbon credit route. So that is the non-permanence risk assessment, your auditing mechanisms, the safeguards, whether they are stakeholder safeguards and the requirements for free and prior informed consent, or whether they are social and environmental safeguards, overissuance safeguards, and so forth. And that just to clarify on the Verra Scope 3, that just recently went through the public commenting period and it's looking to be launched later this year. Now, regardless of, I guess, the path forward, I think what is important is that we need to ensure that the Scope 3 accounting and the interventions come with an inclusive approach. So I've spent a lot of my work working with smallholder farmers and operators throughout the tropics with supply chains such as coffee and cocoa, where you have a lot of smallholder farmers involved. And so the challenges around the monitoring, reporting, verification, addressing the need for traceability, potential support in how to actually set up these contracts, claiming removals, potentially needing to address Scope 1 and 2 emissions and so forth, is particularly challenging for them and requires a lot of support. And that's something that I'm particularly focused on. Now, the last point I'd like to make is that I briefly mentioned the Guardian article and the journey of the voluntary carbon markets and carbon credits. I fully expect that the equivalent Guardian articles will be coming for the Scope 3 sector. And so this is certainly not to discourage companies from engaging in this. It's imperative that we all do, but it's to highlight the need for quality and integrity throughout this process so that we don't repeat any of the mistakes that might have been made in the past. Thank you for listening. Let me pass it back on to John.
Thanks, Nathan. And we have a question here that I think touches on what you were just saying about a potentially upcoming Guardian article. Is, with the uncertainty associated with emissions factors used to calculate Scope 3 emissions, how do you know that you're actually moving the needle or the meter versus just picking a lower factor or using a different consultant who uses the lower factor?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I honestly think part of this is that we need to, as difficult and probably expensive as it is, moving towards primary data and site-specific data as quickly as possible. I understand mapping out these supply chains is easier said than done, but it's going to be very valuable work. I'm not sure if that fully addresses the question, but happy for a follow-up.
Well, I think this is a great bridge to Kendall talking about how to work with suppliers on this. So, Kendall, let's bring you into the conversation.
Perfect, and thanks so much, and thank you again for having me today as well. I'm really excited today. I'm going to talk about Guy House's supplier engagement program, which is the supplier leadership on climate transition. You see here on the slide, Supplier Locked. That's often the name we call it by, just a shortened version. I'll discuss why we started the program, what challenges the program seeks to solve, what it's like to be one of our 29 partners enrolling suppliers in our climate courses, and then also what it's like to be a supplier taking our courses. But just briefly, some history on our program. Supplier Lock started as a collaboration at a November 2019 roundtable in Philadelphia with 3 large food and beverage companies, Mars, McCormick, and PepsiCo. So as Nathan mentioned, companies in that flag industry often Scope 3 is about 90% of their total emissions. So the founding of this program really started with flag companies back in 2019. We know sustainability at its best is a collective action. So together we mapped the supply chain, and we knew at that moment that education was really going to be the key to getting suppliers to start and to begin taking action to reduce emissions. Today, large corporates, we call our partners, join the Supplier Lock Collaborative and invite dozens or sometimes even hundreds of their suppliers to join our sustainability courses. We work together with those partners as well to ensure that each supplier organization is starting our courses at the proper level. And again, at its heart, Supplier Locked really is this climate school, but we do a lot more than that. The program inspires collaboration between our 29 partners. We also guide discussion between the suppliers and our subject matter experts. And then we also create new opportunities for our partners to interact with their own suppliers. And as it grows, Supplier Locked is shaping the conversation around strategies for shifting supplier mindsets, helping suppliers move faster in decarbonization. And in general, we're really building suppliers' capacity. So I'll go into some more detail on how we're doing that. Today, Locked spans almost every industry. So as I mentioned, we started with partners in the food and beverage sector, but we've expanded to fashion, pharma, media entertainment, manufacturing, and many more industries. And we've also grown our global presence. So we have companies participating from almost every continent and over 79 countries as well. Our program is guiding climate leaders on alignment of their expectations to enable supplier capacity building, and is also meeting suppliers where they're at. So as I mentioned earlier, Supplier Locked at its heart is really a climate school, and that's what we're looking at here on the slide. I'm going to walk through some of our courses that we offer and what it's like to be a supplier taking these classes. Our suppliers in the program have direct access to our subject matter experts through live course seminars. There are 5 live sessions over the course of 6 months for each of our courses. This also includes office hours, so smaller group sessions where suppliers can get questions answered. And we also respond to questions over email and in discussion forums. And then we also utilize an online learning platform to make the courses interactive. This is also where we store all course material, additional resources, links to a lot of the protocols, for example, that Nathan mentioned. So of course, greenhouse gas protocol, SBTI guidance, and things like that as well. And then we're very active on our discussion forums. So again, I think probably hearing a theme from me is this program was established to build capacity, but also to really inspire collaboration. So any mechanisms we can use to give suppliers opportunity to speak to one another or our experts. And then after taking the courses, we do recognize our suppliers by awarding them with badges for reaching key milestones as well. And we see this as a great motivation to complete the work. All right, so I'll dive in. Again, looking at this slide, we do offer 6 courses, and we put these over 5 stages of development. So our first 2 courses here are our Scope 1 and 2 and our Scope 3 footprinting course. Many of you on the line might be familiar with footprinting. And in each of these courses, we cover why footprinting is important, what the greenhouse gas protocol is, how to get started with data collection, where to identify emission factors, where to identify more accurate emission factors to the question that was posed earlier, how to perform actual calculations, and then we also recommend process improvements over time as well. And then our next course and the second course, which is the second step in our journey, is our target setting course. So this course is focused on helping our suppliers set a science-based target with SBTI. Our following course is focused on how to build a plan to actually meet that target. So how are you going to reduce your emissions over time? And in bucket number 4 here, this course is focused on disclosing to CDP and back to the partners who have asked our suppliers to participate in the program. And then finally, and I think very exciting at the top, our 5th step here in implement. This is the top of our mountain image. This is where we support our suppliers as they begin to actually implement change and build on what they've learned in our core journey, which is that 1 through 4 steps in this graphic. So this course really helps suppliers take action in clear and simple and step-by-step ways. We include video tutorials, technical templates, quizzes, more, plus that one-on-one support I mentioned earlier. And this implementation stage is really aimed to help suppliers and their teams do things like complete an energy audit or build a facility level action plan for projects, or even learn how to procure renewable electricity from vendors. So again, this program, it was really founded with the goal of education and capacity building for suppliers. And what we've seen is this individual touch through all the courses is really what's leading to success and to change. With that, I want to just highlight a few of our metrics from the course that we've seen as well. So as I've mentioned, we have 29 partners in the program. These are our partners who are inviting their suppliers to take the courses. So we've had over 1,400 supplier companies take the course, which, as I mentioned, is we're now covering 79 countries. So really exciting to see that. Each of our supplier companies also can invite more than 1 individual, up to 5, to take our courses. So we've had 4,500 individuals enrolled across the board, across those 6 courses I just went through as well. And we're always glad to see our percent here. 94% of our supplier companies do say that the program helps them make climate progress. So what we mean by this is if they're in our Scope 1 and 2 footprinting course, after the live sessions and the course concludes 6 months later, they've actually completed their Scope 1 and 2 footprint aligned with greenhouse gas protocol. So seeing that big 94% really showing the action that's coming out of the education. And then the 80% of our suppliers do report achieving that milestone within a year. So as some of you might know, when you're doing footprinting, there's a lot of data collection, there's a lot of work within your organization. We're glad to see that of a lot of our suppliers, that 80% is able to do this type of work within 1 year. And then the last thing I want to mention that we're always excited to see, we have 869 badges that we've given out. So these badges are for when any company who has taken a course has actually achieved the outcome. So I mentioned, maybe they've completed their footprint at the end, maybe they've completed their abatement roadmap on how they're going to reduce emissions. So these are the companies who are receiving badges. We've had around 500 companies, and then again, almost 1,000 badges given out. So it's really great to see the education turned into action with our suppliers all through this collaborative effort together. I'll pause there if there's questions, and back to you, John.
Thanks, Kendall. That's very exciting. So we did get one question I'm curious about. So you did mention the GHG protocol and SBTI, but are there any other sort of specific frameworks or tools that you are suggesting to suppliers that they might use for this?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we mostly teach to the greenhouse gas protocol and SBTI. We do teach to specific subsets of that. So for example, I know, again, Nathan called out the flag sector and the flag protocol. We do teach the flag guidance, for example, with greenhouse gas protocol. A lot of our suppliers, though, across all those industries come to us with questions specific to their sector. In that case, there's additional guidance, for example, for the steel sector, and we're happy to jump on with them, walk through that, provide them more individual resources for that. But our courses overall, we just teach to greenhouse gas protocol and SBTI as well as CDP itself.
Great. Well, that was a great overview of what can happen, but now let's drill down and get an example from a company who's actually doing this. So, Kat, I'm gonna let you take it away.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. I'm Kat Malek-Hood. I'm part of the Global Responsible Sourcing team at the Estée Lauder companies, where I lead our supplier climate engagement work. I'm thrilled to be here today to share how ELC is partnering with our suppliers to reduce Scope 3 emissions and drive meaningful climate action across our value chain. To give a bit of context, in 2020, ELC publicly committed to achieving science-based emissions reduction targets by 2030. These targets were approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative, and they span across all 3 scopes of emissions, as you can see, including the critical Scope 3 emissions generated throughout our supply chain. We report on our progress annually through our sustainability report, our climate transition plan, as well as our own CDP disclosures. Now, because the majority of our emissions do come from our supply chain, achieving our targets depends on our supplier action. That's why supplier engagement is central to our climate strategy. We're supporting our suppliers with best-in-class tools and resources, like Kendall just mentioned, our capability building opportunities through Supplier Locked. And then we're also collecting emissions data through trusted industry platforms like CDP. In 2022, ELC became the first beauty company to join Supplier Locked. And since then, we've had over 90 of our suppliers participating, and those suppliers are spanning across all of our key categories. So we have raw materials suppliers, packaging, third-party manufacturing, as well as our indirect procurement suppliers, such as advertising partners, consulting partners, you name it. What's so great about this program is that it's designed to support suppliers across the industry, again, as Kendall mentioned, and this is really making the scale of its impact even more significant for partners such as ELC. We're also seeing significant results from the program. So we've had more than 20 ELC suppliers that have set or committed to set a science-based target since we joined the program. And many more of our suppliers are advancing through the early stages, such as completing their GHG footprint calculations and building that foundation for climate action. We've also heard from our suppliers directly about how valuable this support has been. So many of our suppliers were initially overwhelmed by the complexity of the SBTI framework, or they were unsure how to begin measuring emissions, right? Like we just talked about, there's different frameworks you have to apply. It's very complex, and we really wanted to figure out a way to support our suppliers. So this is where the structure of Locked really came in. It has monthly assignments, expert-led office hours, and suppliers are really able to gain the knowledge and confidence to make real progress. Alongside Supplier Locked, ELC has also been a committed participant in the CDP supply chain program, and we're proud to be entering our 5th year in 2025. We've seen significant participation from our suppliers that has grown each year. In 2023, we had 250 suppliers submitting responses, and that number climbed even higher in 2024. Through these CDP disclosures, we're able to gather critical data from suppliers. So we're gathering GHG emissions data, we're gathering their renewable energy usage, as well as their progress on their targets. And some of the high quality emissions data can actually be directly integrated into ELC's own annual carbon footprint calculation, which gives us a clear view of the supply chain's contribution and also helps us account for actions that reduce emissions, such as suppliers incorporating additional renewable energy use into their own manufacturing processes. What else is so important about CDP is that it enables us to identify new opportunities for collaboration. Because suppliers can also disclose their data once and then share it with multiple customers, it reduces the reporting burden while also promoting transparency and scalability for our suppliers. And this approach has helped us, as well as our peers, to accelerate supplier engagement and expand the impact of climate data across the industry. Looking ahead, ELC remains deeply committed to evolving our supplier climate engagement efforts year over year. We know that tackling Scope 3 emissions requires collaboration. That's why we're here today. And we're proud to be working alongside our suppliers and peers to reduce emissions across the value chain and also to stay on track toward our 2030 climate goals. Thanks. I'll pass it back to you, John.
Sure, Kat. And a question here. So how did you choose your initial set of suppliers to engage?
Yeah, there's a few ways you can do that. It really depends on what your supply chain looks like. For ELC, because we're able to get this emissions data from our suppliers, we do look at high emissions impact from suppliers, right? Those are going to be the most critical for our reduction strategy. And then we're also looking at those strategic suppliers who we have a strong partnership with, who are really interested in collaborating with us, understanding what's a priority to ELC, such as climate action, and who we know will be a good opportunity to test out some of these new opportunities, right? And then we've just been expanding over year, as I mentioned, from that. But that's a really good place to start, is like the relationship with your suppliers, and then that emissions, which sometimes is just calculated in the beginning based on your spend with that supplier. But that'll give you a pretty good indicator of who's a priority for that engagement.
Great. So none of this happens without some technology. And so I want to shift over to Carla Woydt. And Carla, give us your perspective on everything you've heard so far today.
Well, yeah, thanks very much. So yeah, I mean, everything I heard is something that we also discuss a lot with our buyers. So it's recurring themes, I would say, starting with, look, I have my my emissions inventory spanning scope 1, 2, and 3. Now I have defined targets, but especially scope 3 is challenging because there is a data limitation or a challenge to gather all of the data. There is a challenge to set reasonable targets, and ultimately also to account for the emissions that cannot be avoided until reaching an net zero. So the kind of the buzzword of collaborative action, supply engagement, all of that is something that we hear very often, and that is pretty much true for every single step of a corporate's climate strategy, right? So starting with, we heard a lot about data collection, about corporate carbon footprinting, really making sure that you get all of the data, can be through CDP supply chain program or any other supplier engagement programs. There is also collaborative action involved in defining reduction activities, right? I think not every single supplier has to invent the wheel from scratch, but can also learn from how others in the same industry reduce activities. And then coming to the last part of every single climate strategy, which is engaging with the carbon market and neutralizing emissions that cannot be reduced. It's actually the same question, right? How can I most efficiently engage with my supply chain? How can I make sure that my targets are kind of broken down to the targets, or kind of to the different parts that my suppliers are contributing? And ultimately also, how can I make it most or as easy as possible for my suppliers to contribute and to mitigate this last part of their unavoidable emissions?
Sorry, I was muted there. So I'm curious, we have a question here. So what role do you see companies playing in enabling and catalyzing renewable energy procurement for their suppliers? For example, procuring additional RECs and allocating them to their suppliers' scope 2 or reducing scope 3?
I think that is also part of a climate strategy, right? So RECs are a tool that can be used to account for scope 2 emissions, and this can be for the direct emissions, but also for supply emissions. So something definitely to take into considerations. It's also part of the CDP reporting, part of RE100, so also recognized by many larger frameworks, and something that should be included in any robust climate strategy. Yes.
Fantastic. So keep your questions coming, everyone in the audience. I've got a bunch of them here to go through. Kat, I've got a question for you. What do you use to entice vendors to participate? Is it telling them that they have to? Is there a carrot, a stick? How are you doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it differs by company, right? Relationship with your suppliers. For us, we've had such positive engagement with our suppliers. I think in this industry, as we're talking about, so many companies are asking their suppliers to do this that it's becoming an expectation across the board, right? ELC is not the only one who's asking for climate action, for reporting their emissions, for trying to reduce emissions. And so I think that collaborative approach is really what has benefited ELC so much. So we haven't had to have like a carrot or stick approach. I will also say, you know, SLOC makes a huge difference as well, because if we're going to suppliers asking for them to set a science-based target and they come back and they say, we don't know how, or we don't have the capacity, we can just pop them right into the program. ELC sponsors the program for our suppliers, so it's also at no cost. So it's kind of hard to say no to that opportunity, right, when it's benefiting them and then their other customers as well.
Great. And Kendall, I think I'll ask you the same question. You had experience with all the big companies that are engaging their supply chains. Are there strategies that they're using to get their suppliers to participate?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked as well. So I think we have a large group of partners similar to what Kat said for Estée Lauder, where, you know, there's such a collaborative ask that they don't need to do a carrot and a stick yet, but we do have partners who use both a carrot and a stick. So we have probably of the 29, I would say only 2 or 3 who have really had to say this program and setting a target is a requirement for their suppliers. That strategy definitely does work, but they have to have a close relationship and a way to support their suppliers to meet that requirement. Then we have a lot of our partners who do more of the carrot approach. For them, they'd like to see their suppliers setting targets and reporting emission reductions to them. So they actually frame it more as, we're sponsoring, as Kat mentioned, you to participate in Supplier Locked. We're paying for it on your behalf. It's going to be a tool that makes it really easy for you to meet our requirements. So they frame it more as they're setting them up for success to get in the program. And then for us, from the Supplier Locked perspective, each of our courses, and even before we enroll our suppliers in the courses and we're preparing them for that, that journey, we teach a lot of the business need for sustainability. We focus on helping them get internal buy-in within their own organization. So that's a big piece of our content as well, is, you know, what's the benefit to you as an individual? What's the benefit to you as a company to get this done?
Great. And Carla, I want to come back to you. You know, Scope 3 emissions can, I think Kat mentioned more than 80%. I think that's not uncommon for a lot of different companies. So the scale is huge. And so what are you seeing in terms of transparency? And, you know, Nathan mentioned some articles in The Guardian. What do you see around transparency for accounting and monitoring Scope 3 emissions, and then how to take care of those unavoidable emissions?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we are. I used to work for CDP, and I used to head the supply chain program for Europe. And back then, it was a real challenge to get all of the suppliers to report on the emissions that can be allocated to a certain customer. And I think this has gotten much better, but it is still challenging. I mean, we talked about 90%. For some organizations, it is even higher. I think the average overall is around 75%. And supply chains are pretty complex, right? And then there are different tiers of suppliers, and collecting all of that information is a challenge, and it is complex. And it is even more complex to then kind of inspire the collaborative action when it comes to aligned mitigation strategies and aligned activities when engaging with the voluntary carbon market. And I think this is exactly where we come in, and where kind of the market and the complexity of the market exactly mandates that the customer is taking action, aligning a portfolio centrally based on clear data and based exactly on those transparency measures, making sure that it's high integrity credits, really using the data to inform like a robust procurement, but also portfolio selection strategy, and then kind of allocate the emissions according to the contribution of each and every single supplier, so that not every supplier has to define a portfolio themselves, but can really pull centrally from one portfolio aligned with that customer.
And Carla, do you help your folks who utilize this portfolio approach sort of educate suppliers as to how this is being used and how this is impacting what they may not fully understand?
Yes, sure. I think that's a very common topic. I mean, first and foremost, if you think in a supply chain case or scope 3 case, the default case would be that you pre-align a portfolio with the customer. But then you can also build certain sub-portfolios that are aligned with certain characteristics of your supply chain partners. And there, of course, again, a lot of guidance is needed for each and every single supply chain partner to understand what they are really investing in, what's the impact, and what is also the risk, quite frankly, right? So every single carbon credit comes with a risk. There are different risks that can be regarding the delivery, that can be regarding the price, but also just quality risk, as we already mentioned earlier in that webinar. And I think it's critical that everyone who invests in carbon credits really understands the risks and has kind of an informed decision, or can make an informed decision about which risk am I willing to take and what are the risks that I want to avoid, and thereby also contributing to the scope 3 emissions of a customer.
Oh, fantastic. So Nathan, I've got a couple of questions here for you. One, I know with a number of the companies that we work with, that the omnibus has been something they've been trying to sort through when it comes to CSRD. Any sort of perspective on sort of the scaling back of EU regulations to only include first and second tier and supply chain scope 3 calculations?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I guess firstly, so much of this journey has been voluntary. So I think moving towards compliance is already a good step, even if it isn't going the 400 miles, so to speak. Ideally, I mean, as all organizations at different levels started adhering to this, the suppliers further on down the chain will be gathering this data as well. So I think over time, that should help address that gap. But I understand the concerns around it, of course. And as I said, I take slight comfort in the fact that this hasn't been so voluntary based for so long, and at least we're starting to put some requirements in place, which I think is long overdue.
So one other question for you, Nathan. How do you address the thought that scope 3 is double counting? This questioner says we spent a lot of time, resources trying to calculate, develop scope 3 emissions. Seems like there should be a more efficient way. Is anyone working on any alternatives?
Double counting, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that's where some of the allocation components come in, right? Ideally, under these frameworks, and not just looking at, say, the emissions that are coming off a plot of land where you're sourcing a commodity, but also allocating those emissions depending on how many other commodities are being produced there. I don't know if that's the concern of the double counting, or if it is the emissions being reported as, for example, a scope 1 or 2 by one corporate and a scope 3 by another. I think that in a way almost highlights also the importance of figuring out mechanisms to actually finance these interventions and transitions that are going to be needed further on down the line, and include contracting mechanisms for passing on those improvements to off-takers, to corporates you're selling to.
Great. So, Carla, that's a good transition point. So, what do you see as the biggest hurdles to companies participating in the voluntary carbon markets?
Well, I think one of the biggest hurdles is definitely the complexity. So many buyers are just very overwhelmed by the different technologies existing, the different standards, different also broader types, and then also use cases, right? So it's really important that when engaging with the carbon market, you start with defining your overall goal, right? So is it because you want to meet your net zero target? Is it because you want to invest in carbon credits on the transition to net zero? Is it both? So that's definitely one part. And then once you have your clear target, really defining what do I need to fulfill that target. And then you are kind of confronted with a lot of different technologies and a lot of different standards, a lot of different prices, and also a lot of different risk profiles. And I think this complexity doesn't really help to help buyers to build trust in that market. With then, on the other hand, the scandals and the reputation through articles such as The Guardian coming up that even increases the insecurity in that market as a whole, but also kind of in making this first step of engaging with that market. And I think there it really helps to seek guidance. The good thing about it is all of that guidance is already out there. So working with a knowledgeable partner who you trust, who helps you to build that trust, who helps you to define a portfolio according to your needs based on clear data, and then also define a procurement strategy that leverages long-term offtakes for the project types that are projected to be scarce in the future, where you can hedge for price increases in the future, but also leverage kind of spot deals for more short-term beyond value chain activities, for instance, is really, really critical for buyers who are not that knowledgeable in the market, but who also want to have a clear kind of pathway to net zero that has kind of a longer time horizon and seek guidance and also monitoring that really accompanies corporates on the way towards net zero.
You mentioned procurement, and it raised the question. Locke talks about their training. Is there a certain amount of sort of upfront training that has to occur before people really understand how to engage with these markets?
Is that a question for me still?
For you, Carla. Yes. Sorry.
Okay, so a certain amount of training, no, it also depends on where we start. We see that there are very, very different levels of knowledge about the market. So I couldn't put a number to it, but we see that it takes weeks to months until you really get to a clearly defined portfolio, especially if we're talking about longer term engagements. I think on average it is 1 to 2 months. It can be longer, but it also can be much shorter if a company is really clear in knowing what they want, having defined their targets, and already clearly mapped out the budget and the path to achieving the target. So there is not really one way. There are several different ways, but what all of them have in common is that they need a certain level of guidance upfront, but also on the path in adjusting to current market or developing market trends, anything that comes up in terms of new regulations, new laws, new frameworks. So all of that may impact how you engage with the carbon market, and all of that also needs some guidance of experts who do pretty much nothing else than kind of monitoring and tracking those changes and developments.
Great, thanks. So speaking of expert guidance, Nathan, so what is the Science Based Target Initiative's current position on using carbon credits for offsets?
Nice. Thanks, John. That's a good question. And I would say that in the past, it was a bit unclear exactly what role they could play, and there are various publications that came out in the last year or so regarding that. But just last month, the corporate net zero standard version 2.0 from SBTi launched for public comment, and so that new stance isn't finalized, but you can go ahead and look at that draft and see how they are positioning that. Now, as a quick answer, I mean, regarding offsets in general, that falls more under the beyond value chain mitigation bucket for SBTi. But in the newest draft, they're providing a lot more clarity on how carbon credits produced within the value chain and so forth can be used towards the decarbonization route. Any any rules regarding the type of emissions you might be dealing with and their permanence and what type of credits you might need to offset them. So yeah, I highly recommend having a closer look at the newest draft.
Great. And Kat, yeah, I think Kat, I'll ask you first. I'm going to return to the hurdles question. So what are the biggest hurdles you're experiencing with engaging with your suppliers, or are your suppliers experiencing?
Yeah, there's a lot of hurdles in this field, right? And we've spoken about a few of them. I think measuring emissions, understanding how to set a science-based target is always a hurdle. You know, if a company doesn't have a sustainability team built out, and again, I'll plug Supplier Lock's impact in the space. That's been tremendous to help our suppliers. And then, you know, starting to actually make reductions is a challenge as well. And so implementing renewable energy use has really been an area of focus for our suppliers. There's been a new course in Supplier Locked. I know I just keep plugging this, but it really is a great program that we utilize so much for our scope 3 reductions. And so it's great that the program is actually starting to develop more detailed support for our suppliers and actually starting to identify and implement reductions, both with their scope 1 and 2, as well as their own scope 3. I think a bigger challenge moving forward will just be continuing to measure emissions deeper into the value chain, which, you know, we've spoken about a little bit, but just getting a better understanding of what that scope 3 really looks like. But, you know, we're trying to measure and reduce at the same time. It's a challenging space, but at least we're all collaborating on this, and new tools and new resources are popping up all the time. And so we're really starting to see tremendous impact.
Great. And Kendall, I'm going to turn to you and ask the same question. What are you seeing as hurdles, and I guess how are you helping your companies overcome them?
Yeah, definitely. I think, as Kat mentioned, there's definitely a lot of hurdles, but two main ones that really stand out in our program. First, of course, just data collection. A lot of our companies who are taking our courses are small and medium-sized enterprises, or they're just getting started on their sustainability journey. So collecting data to do their footprinting can be a big challenge. We help them in the program with that. We have templates to get them started. We also have a lot of recommendations and tools to help them identify who in their organization might have the data they're looking for, and then how to transform it into more of a format appropriate for footprinting. And then the second one, which is probably the biggest hurdle we see with suppliers in our program, is gaining leadership buy-in. So definitely a key component, especially when you're ready to submit a target to SBTI. You want to get leadership at your organization to support you in that. Similar, we teach, often a lot of sustainability topics, a lot of what we cover today can be very technical. So we teach how to change that technical communication style into a more business mindset, and how that can be presented to leadership, while also having some various calculations to prove that potentially some emission reduction paths are actually more financially pleasing and things like that for the organization. They might actually be the cheaper option. So building that case, presenting it to leadership, and getting their buy-in. And that last piece with buy-in too, I think it really helps with our program, again, with that collaborative aspect and the partnership aspect. So we have, companies like Estée Lauder who have asked their suppliers to participate. So I think it's twofold: through learning how to do those presentations and how to talk to leadership, they're able to go, and they're also able to then say, Estée Lauder did ask us to do this. So it helps to have both combined.
Great. And just sticking with you, Kendall, lots of positive comments, but one person asks, it sounds great. How long does the course take? And this questioner is asking, they're reluctant to ask a vendor, especially an SME, to spend money and time. So what's the investment that's required?
Also a great question. Also a common question we get. I hate to say, but the answer, it does vary a little bit. Each of our courses, so if we think back to that mountain I showed, we have those 5 stages, which is actually made up of 6 courses. Each of our courses we've tested, we've built to be 6 months, so 5 live sessions across 6 months. The reason they are that length, so for example, our Scope 1 and 2 footprinting course does last 6 months. At the end of those 6 months, we see about 80% of suppliers with a complete Scope 1 and 2 footprint. We have it built out for that length, just based on average time to get the data collected, to speak to the proper individuals within the organization, and to actually come out with a tangible result from the course. That said, we have some more efficient pathways. We all want suppliers to get to their targets and to actually be starting to take action to reduce emissions after measuring. So particularly SMEs, we have some courses they can skip. We also have some abbreviated versions of our courses that are going to be coming out as well to make that journey quicker. So if you were to take the traditional path, those 6 courses, each 6 months, that's 3 full years to complete them all. Throughout those 3 years, you're already setting a target halfway through and taking some action. And again, those abbreviated versions are coming out soon so we can move even faster.
Fantastic. And one last question for you, I'm sure you'll appreciate. Where can someone get information about your courses?
Yeah, I love that question. We have a website actually for Supplier Locked. So it's supplierlocked.com. So it's supplier and then LOCT.com. On the website, on the homepage, we have our overview of the courses. And then also on that homepage at the very bottom, we have a interest form. So if you have additional questions on the courses or anything like that, our team will get back to you. We can provide more detail on the material and things like that. That all said, our courses aren't public, but once suppliers are invited, they'll have access. So just an overview on the website, and then we can always help one-on-one via email too.
Fantastic. So I know we're getting close to time, but Carla, I want to ask this question. So around the markets, are there any bridge financing tools that can help suppliers transition and that can be made available, to help with this voluntary carbon markets?
Well, I mean, I think there are different finance tools. There are different approaches to engaging with the market, and I think there are different starting points. I already said, I mean, having a clear picture in mind of what I want to achieve, building a portfolio based on data is definitely a very good starting point. But then there are concepts of how to engage. So not every single supplier has to cover all of the Scope 1, 2, 3 residual emissions when starting to engage with the voluntary carbon market. I think collaborating with the supply chain and with the customer is one good way to start, really just working with a smaller part of your emissions, which can be one clear target, really satisfying the Scope 3 emissions of one of my customers, but also maybe start with my own complete Scope 1 and 2 emissions can help already bring the cost down and not engage kind of the full scope of emissions, the full scope of the emissions inventory that you have calculated in your footprinting, right? So I think there are several approaches. It doesn't always have to be a ton for ton, but it is important to start engaging, to get familiar with the different concepts, get familiar with how to select portfolios, and also make sure that there will be enough supply when it really become a requirement from a regulative requirement or requirement from your customers.
Thanks. And we're coming up on all the time we have for today. So I want to thank all our speakers for great conversation, and to my colleagues behind the scenes, Jill Marte and Ambry Bosworth, for making everything run so smoothly. If you'd like to rewatch this webinar, the recording will be archived on trellis.net, and our team will email you the link once it's available later today. You can also check out the resources on this topic by clicking on the resources button on your screen. You can see there's a report there from CEEZER, The Ripple Effect, Addressing Scope 3 Emissions in an Interconnected Carbon Economy. Lastly, I need to push to the slide. If you want to watch more Trellis webinars, please visit www.trellis.net/webinars. And on behalf of my colleagues at Trellis and all our great speakers today, thanks so much for joining us. I'm John Davies. Until next time, have a great day.